When we're dealing with violence, it's really important to be as factual as possible, right? To get as close as we possibly can to the realities on the ground. Who does what to whom, and how do they do it? In what context? And how do the other people around respond to that? What do they do about it? And what does the victim experience and do and feel? How do they respond? What happens for them in that moment? We need to get as close to the facts on the ground as we possibly can, knowing that we're prone to misinterpretation and bias, knowing that language is power, knowing that every description is incomplete, at least. We know these things, but we want to try to get as close to the facts as we possibly can. And that's extremely important in cases of violence because there is so much deception and so much secrecy. You know, this is, as you know, this is the statue on that's the Indian Ocean, that's just south of Perth. I like this because the arrows signify human interaction, right? The arrows goes around interaction, but where there's violence, a great deal of the interaction is underground. You don't see it, you don't know what's happening. You'll never know. A person might tell you about being beaten up, but they won't tell you about being raped because that's just too humiliating to say possibly, or you're just not qualified to hear it from them. Could be a whole bunch of different reasons. So you might hear things, you might hear very important things, but there's a great deal you won't hear from most people. And if you ever think you're getting the full load of facts, you're kidding yourself. There's always more happening. It's always more complex than you think it is. And so keeping open to that possibility is a very important part of the practice. We know that where there is so-called domestic violence, and I say so-called domestic violence because it's a funny term in a way, isn't it? Domestic violence, as opposed to what? Exotic violence? I mean, it occurs in a domicile, but actually part of the time it also occurs other places like in the mall or in the car but it occurs in I guess a domestic scenario, but it's a bit of a strange term. So we know when there's domestic violence, there's also more likely to be child abuse. There's also more likely to be child sexualized abuse. There's also more likely to be sexual assault and rape in situations where there's domestic and family violence. So often when you're intervening in a domestic violence case, you're intervening in a case that has these other features too. These other forms of violence are also happening or have happened. It's extremely important to keep that awareness, right? Because that'll tell you a great deal about why a person might say some things to you but not other things. And it'll tell you what kinds of questions you can ask and what kind of questions maybe you shouldn't ask and so forth. So I'm going to be talking to this kind of framework. We originally developed this because when we started looking really carefully at the way we interview people, the way we talk with people who are coming for counseling or what have you, all of these factors become extremely important. These are, you could call them common elements or common parts of the fact pattern in cases of violence. You have to know who people are and you have to know where they live, right? What is their life world? Because if you don't know that, you can't really understand how they make sense of the world. Who are they spiritually and culturally? You don't necessarily know how to talk with people at all. And also the context, the physical, social, the physical and material context has a great deal to do with how people commit violence and how people respond to it. So if you're an Indigenous woman living in a remote location in northern Canada where there is no police presence during the week, if your partner beats you up, and then as one woman said to me, every time he beats me up, he wants to have sex on me. So if he beats you up and then he climbs on your body and he wants to assault you, and you know that the police are 2.5 hours away if you phone, then kicking him in the nuts, screaming and yelling and running out of the house is not a viable option because no one's going to be there to help you. So what do you have to do? Pretend to like it, go along with it, go shopping in your head, talk to your grandmother in your head, take him somewhere where the kids can't hear. You know, you got to do something else. In other words, the way in which the victim resists the perpetrator is tied to the social and cultural context and the material context. You can't understand why a person might respond this way versus that way unless you really get a sense of the social and material conditions they're in. That information is crucially important. The social setting and the interaction is important because a beating in a busy nightclub where there's 200 people around at 2 in the morning is a different animal than a beating in a deserted parking lot where there isn't anyone around to help. Because if you're in a busy nightclub and there's 200 people watching, you might be able to fight back physically because you know people will break it up. But if you're in a deserted parking lot, you're all by yourself, the most prudent form of resistance might be to turtle. Right? That's a Canadian hockey term. It might be to turtle, okay? So, in other words, the way in which the victim responds to the offender has less to do with personality traits or early childhood experiences or mental disorders or anything else. It has less to do with that than it has to do with the context in which they live. The social, material realities at play in the moment. That's what people are dealing with. The nature of the offending action. So men who use violence against their partners drive away their families, as we know, right? Socially and physically isolate the victim, very often. Use unpredictability to create a context of fear. Threaten that if you tell anyone I'm going to kill you, I'm going to hang myself in the shed, and the kids are going to see me in the shed when they come home from school, right? So the reason that perpetrators do these kinds of things is not from some sort of abstract need for power and control. It's much more strategic and purposeful than that. You know, you need to control the social environment around the person to prevent other people from responding to them appropriately, to keep it secret. So you need to isolate the person in order that you can violate them without the person being protected by other people. That is strategic, even skillful, controlled and deliberate behavior. It's not out of control behavior. The more closely you look at how people actually exercise violence and power, the more you see it's controlled, deliberate, skillful, strategic, systematic. The whole notion that people lose control is bullshit. We've been talking about perpetrators of violence as losing control, not having skills, not knowing any better, being socialized into being this kind of man for how many years? All of those explanations reduce the responsibility of the offender and shift blame to the victim.